Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are connecting to us from. I'm Michael Foyer. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development here at GW, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. We have some people with us in the Student Center, and we have a lot of people, I think, connecting to us remotely for this opportunity to learn about a very interesting episode in American history from someone who has produced what I consider to be a truly masterful podcast series, and you'll hear more about that in a moment. Let me just start by thanking our magnificent staff, to Ron Waters, who is our communications director, and in her spare time is the executive producer, engineer, and all-purpose maven when it comes to setting us up for anything that's even vaguely technological. So thank you again to Ron and Victoria Mikulášky from our office in the Dean's office on the admin team. Thank you so much. And I know that Meg Holland is, I think, online. And hello and thank you to Meg. This is part of a series called Conversations That Matter. It was developed under the leadership of our Mayberg Center here in the graduate school. And I therefore want to say a special thanks to the Mayberg Family Foundation for their ongoing and very generous support. And today's talk and Andrew Lapin's visit with us is made possible by a gift from an anonymous donor, and we say thank you for that as well. Here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to introduce Andrew Lapin in a moment. Andrew will do a presentation based on the podcast. Then I will invite up here to our lovely salon two very distinguished educators, one who is Rabbi Dan Zemmel from Temple Micah here in Washington, D.C., and the other who is Professor Lionel Howard, a member of the faculty in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development. And we're going to talk about what we have seen and heard from Andrew's presentation in terms of lessons that it might bear for us with respect to teaching difficult histories and narratives about history, and thinking about history as a way to connect even to current events, and I think you'll see why. Andrew Lapin, as I said, is the creator and the host of this podcast series called Radioactive, which is all about Father Coughlin. Andrew is the managing editor of local news for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. He has been an editor-in-chief at the Detroit Jewish News and a film critic for NPR, Vulture, The Economist, and other outlets. He has received various awards and fellowships, and it's been a great pleasure for me personally to get to know Andrew. Since I heard the podcast, was very taken by it, and unlike other people who I've written to sort of blindly, Andrew actually answered, and it was a pleasure to get to know you that way, Andrew. He grew up in the Detroit suburb of Huntington Woods, Michigan, and I think you'll see why that's relevant to this afternoon's presentation also. So first, please welcome Andrew Lapin, and then when Andrew is done, we will invite our two other guests, our discussants, and we'll have a conversation which I think will matter. For those who are tuning into this through Facebook Live, I'm no expert in this, but they tell me that there's a little section there where you can enter comments. And when you do that, the comments will be transmitted to us through the magic of the internet, and I will then communicate the comment or the question to our group, and we'll take it from there. So thank you for being with us. Andrew Lapin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Foyer, and thank you to the GW Graduate School of Education for having me today. I'm very excited to be here.
I know how the followers of Marx crushed out liberty in Russia, Spain, and elsewhere. I know what they would do in the streets of New York and Detroit and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia today if they thought they had power to accomplish their ends. Before they grow more forceful and powerful, and it will not be long until they will have done so, before then, it is time to eradicate them mentally, spiritually, and physically from our midst. Thus, the combat today is between the so-called popular front and the Christian front. It is a combat upon whose outcome the destiny of America hinges. It's a destiny of happiness and victory for labor, or misery and slavery for labor. Where do you stand? What do you plan to do? Which emblem do you want to fly alongside the stars and stripes? The hammer and sickle, or the cross of the crucified Redeemer?
Welcome to Radioactive. I'm Andrew Lapin. The voice you just heard was that of Father Charles Coughlin, aka the Radio Priest, who had an extremely popular radio show in the 1920s and 30s at the height of the Great Depression. What you just heard was an actual snippet from his radio show in which he is encouraging his listeners to take up arms against the so-called followers of Marx in the name of Jesus Christ. Before we talk more about Father Coughlin, very briefly, you heard a little bit of intro. My name is Andrew Lapin. I am currently the managing editor for local news at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. We've been around for a little over a century covering news of the Jewish world. I grew up in the Detroit area and was previously the editor-in-chief of the Detroit Jewish News. About 4 years ago, I started work on this podcast. At first, it was independent, and then Tablet Studios became a co-producer of the podcast. They're wonderful producers. We came out with the show last fall. It is an 8-part limited series. Earlier this spring, WNET, New York's PBS station, came on board as well as a co-sponsor. This is what the series looks like if you search for it wherever you get your podcasts, and the entire series is currently available. As Dean Foyer mentioned, I did grow up in Huntington Woods, Michigan, which is just over a mile from this. This is where the journey for me starts. This is the National Shrine of the Little Flower Catholic Church in Royal Oak, Michigan. This is Father Coughlin's church. He started it in 1926 and funded it with the proceeds, listener donated proceeds from his radio show. This church is a really majestic, imposing structure, and it's important to note a few things. One, this is like about a 3-story tall limestone, carving of Jesus on the cross that you see. He's overlooking Woodward Avenue, which is a very popular thoroughfare that links Detroit to the suburbs. So it's very prominent. You can see it from everywhere. Number two, important to note, this is still an active church. This is and an associated Catholic school as well. So it has a very active community. It is one of the largest Catholic churches in the state, and was recently designated as a minor basilica by Pope Francis. So it has a lot of historical import as well. As I said, Coughlin built this church with the funds from his radio show, and when you go inside, the church has sort of its own history of Father Coughlin, plaques dedicated to him, and they tell their version of the story, which focuses on his role as the church's founder and as someone who really brought the budding Catholic community of 1920s boomtown Detroit together and gave them this majestic place of worship. I had heard a different story about the Shrine of the Little Flower from an early age. My dad, when we would drive by it on my way to school or any number of activities, he would say, what we used to call this when we were kids? And I said, no, what? And he said, the Shrine of the Little Fascist. And I said, well, why was that? And he said, well, because the priest who built this church was a fascist and an anti-Semite, and he used his radio show to spread all kinds of anti-Semitic propaganda to the entire country, and people gave him money to do it. I was utterly shocked. This is one of the wildest things I'd ever heard in my life. And the thing about Father Coughlin's history, he was certainly not taught in schools, right? He wasn't even taught in the public school that I went to, and we were the so-called local school to the church and to this history. To my knowledge, he is no massive part of any sort of curriculum on 20th century U.S. history anywhere else. And this makes a certain amount of sense. Coughlin was, by most metrics, not what you would call a major historical figure, right? He never held elected office. He sort of vanished from the national stage very abruptly in about 1942, which is right when the U.S. went to the war effort. And most people who were once around to hear him or hear his radio show are no longer alive. And so it's entered into this weird space where it's out there. You can find information about him. There are books that have been published about him. There was a PBS documentary about him that came out about 30 years ago. But most people don't know him, or if they know him, they don't know sort of the totality of what he stood for. So I think of it as almost an open secret about who this man was and what impact he had on America. And the more I sort of looked into Father Coughlin, the more I thought that I can't let go of him. That to me, he actually was a major historical figure, and my major motivation with the podcast was to try to have other people see that he was a major figure. Why do I see him as a major figure? Well, his influence lasts from the Roaring '20s all through the Great Depression, and during the Great Depression, he was actually making money. By most metrics, he became fabulously wealthy, personally so, and he did so by taking money from his listeners, who were almost exclusively poor, working class, blue collar Americans who did not have jobs because it was the Great Depression. He commanded an audience of around a quarter of the country at the time. Between 30 and 40 million Americans listened to his weekly radio show between the years of 1926 and 1940. This is a greater audience than you would find today if you combined the audiences of like every major cable TV news show. That's what we're talking about here. Like, this is before an era of media stratification. The radio had just appeared on the scene. Coughlin was one of the very first radio stars, which meant he was one of the very first media stars in the country, period. This brand new technology that was completely unregulated, that if you had it, you were listening to it and you were taking it seriously. Apart from all of that, of course, he was a major American voice for fascism. He was a representative of an extremely large cohort of people in the 1930s who were openly and actively advocating for the U.S. to adapt fascistic or even Nazistic principles. There were, a significant number of people. Coughlin was a huge fan of Mussolini. He wrote a lot of fan mail to him, and he also had certain alignments with Nazis and the Hitler's propaganda ministry actually excerpted a lot of Coughlin's speeches, and so there were a tremendous amount of people who believed these sorts of things, and pretty much leading right up until the U.S. does enter World War II, and Coughlin was probably the most famous voice for that. A good example of the kind of impact he had was this group called the Christian Front, which was a violent paramilitary group that essentially took their marching orders from Father Coughlin. They would listen to his radio show, and then they would go out and violently target Jewish businesses, Jews on the streets, and then they would go and hold their own target practice. They actually were fomenting a plan to overthrow, put down, and destroy by force the government of the United States. That's the exact wordage of what they were charged with when the FBI arrested a large group of them in 1940 and put them on trial. They were using mugshots of FDR as target practice. They had an extremely involved plan to take over the U.S. Capitol and as well as the U.S. banks. And when they were put on trial, Father Coughlin defended them. So we're going to listen to another clip here.
And now, my friends, the title of this address is I Take My Stand.
Coughlin went on the air for his January 7th, 1940 radio address, only a few days after the 17 men had been arrested. He made it clear immediately that he supported them.
All week long, the daily papers and newsreels, particularly those of the East, have been headlining and screening a fantastic story of an alleged seditious plot to overthrow the government of the United States.
He said those suspected of the crime had been taken prisoner by the FBI for political purposes.
Some public officials intimated that the government was playing politics with the Department of Justice. My name has been linked adroitly to this plot to overthrow the government.
Many were calling on Coughlin to disavow the Christian Front, which had been chanting his name as they went out to commit acts of violence and destruction. He refused.
While I do not belong to any unit of the Christian Front, nevertheless, I do not disassociate myself from that movement.
Instead, Coughlin egged them on.
I re-encourage the Christians of America to carry on in this crisis for the preservation of Christianity and Americanism more vigorously than ever, despite this thinly veiled campaign launched by certain publicists and their controllers to vilify both the name and the principles of this pro-American, pro-Christian, anti-communist, and anti-Nazi group.
So there are some familiar elements to what you're hearing, right? He's disavowing the idea that his words are having an impact on this group that is literally chanting his name, but he's also saying I'm not going to disassociate myself from them, and they are pro. This is a group that explicitly wanted to overthrow American democracy, and he's calling them pro-American, and he's blaming the media for blowing all this out of proportion. So I think, like me, you are probably hearing some echoes, some modern day relevancies here. When I look at the Christian Front, I see images of that's some anti-COVID lockdown protesters on the right. That was a local story for me because that was in Michigan state capital of Lansing at the beginning of the pandemic. And then at the bottom, obviously the local story for all of you in Washington, D.C., the January 6th insurrectionists who were, again, prepared to commit violence to overthrow the U.S. government. For these reasons, the reason that I think Father Coughlin looms so large in my mind is that he was the original American demagogue. He was the first American figure to take the mass media and exploit it for his aims by pretending to be a member or speaking for the working class, the disaffected, the people who were feeling like they were being replaced. Like all demagogues, Coughlin was appealing to the prejudices and the fears of his audience. He was also throwing in a lot of his own prejudices, which were largely had to do with communism, and he pushed the idea. There's some popular anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that Jews were behind communism and also behind the banking system, which everyone could blame for the Great Depression, and so there were a lot of reasons to hate Jews if you were Father Coughlin. And I think that people have become a lot more interested in the concept of demagoguery in the modern era, and that's why I think it's really it can be really valuable to understand Father Coughlin through an educational setting. We've seen in pop culture that people are more interested in demagoguery, more interested in fascism. These questions have always been with us. Two of the examples on this page originated in the 1930s, right? In the upper left-hand corner, That is a new theatrical adaptation of Sinclair Lewis's book, It Can't Happen Here. And then the bottom, The Plot Against America, the HBO miniseries based on the Philip Roth novel that took place during Father Coughlin's era. And then that's the Handmaid's Tale on the right. And so all of these things are imagining what would happen if a demagogue was running America. And you don't have to imagine very far. I think Sinclair Lewis was dealing with this a lot in the 30s, just trying to convince people that yes, it can happen here, and in fact it did. Which I think today people will, if they know about demagoguery and kind of how it functions in the media space, they aren't necessarily making the leap to then conclude that it has happened in America. It has actually overthrown the so-called guardrails of liberal democracy. And from where I'm standing, it's important to remind people of that. How might Radioactive function in this way as a so-called teaching tool? This is a really exciting thing for me because I didn't necessarily intend to make this podcast as an education tool, and so I'm really touched that people have found that it actually can serve that purpose. And this is still, early stages, so we're really excited to see where it goes. But the partnership with WNET was a really nice one because they had this initiative already in place called Exploring Hate, which is really about educating people about extremism, racism, and anti-Semitism in America. The podcast fit in really nicely with that mission. And in partnering with them, we were given not only the sort of educational imprimatur of public television, but we also had the opportunity to publish a study guide, list of reading materials and archival materials that I use to make the podcast, which you can find on WNET's website. And I've also received contact from a handful of universities that are interested in incorporating Radioactive into some of their curricula in the fall, and on a wide variety of subjects, which, again, I wasn't expecting, right? But it turns out that you can use Father Coughlin as a stand-in to talk about a lot of other things. So I'll go through some of those things. First of all, there's obviously the fact that he was Catholic, and then there's a whole history of religion, Catholicism to touch on. I did a podcast interview with America magazine, which is a historic Jesuit magazine, where they were really, really interested in plunging into this fascinating story of like what the heck the Catholic Church was doing in the 1930s, how they were responding to Father Coughlin, how they were responding to fascism in Italy, and how they were aligning themselves or not with Nazis, and there's some really fascinating histories of that out there. Father Coughlin plays a major role in understanding how the world's largest religious body was reacting to the existential question of its day. There's also the economics question. This was maybe the most surprising for me, but actually it makes perfect sense if you think about it. The entire appeal of Father Coughlin was economic. He was operating during the Great Depression. It was a period when everyone was focused on economic policy because it was your daily life. And so in the middle of all that, you have this extremely charismatic figure who wants to revoke the gold standard, who has a lot of complex ideas about how he thinks the American economy should work, and he's sharing them every week in language that is decipherable to the average American, decipherable. I don't know how to pronounce that, but you get what I'm saying. He's a character who was passionate about economics and economic policy, and as the economics professor I was talking to said, it helps the students to understand that economics affect people, and that there are people who care very deeply about this, and these are not just abstract issues. Coughlin's whole thing started as economic populism, which he was mixing with a lot of religious, about like Bible study and things like that. That was the early years of his radio show before he found a way to segue into full-on fascism. In Detroit, this is obviously a local story, and so I've seen predictably the most interest from Detroit-based institutions. They're also the ones I worked with the closest. Interviewed historians at the Detroit Historical Museum who were really interested in, the fact that this would transport audiences to the city in its golden era, right, the 1920s, when people were coming to the Motor City from all around to work for this guy, Henry Ford, who, as some of you probably know, was something of an anti-Semite himself, and who does factor into Father Coughlin's story in the podcast. The most interesting archives I found related to Father Coughlin that had not previously been uncovered were recently unsealed archives at the Archdiocese of Detroit, which is, as you could probably understand, a bit squeamish about telling Father Coughlin's history, but the historians I worked with there were great. And they were really eager to see this podcast come out and some of these stories be published. So a lot of crucial, correspondence between the Bishop of Detroit at the time and Coughlin, who was attempting to evade his scrutiny. That is all really crucial information. I'll also add here that the University of Detroit Mercy, which is a Jesuit private school, a few years ago digitized the entire kind of Father Coughlin archives, including his magazine Social Justice and all of his pamphlets and the surviving radio programs, and that is available online for anyone to access. Which also shows that, again, another local Catholic institution that felt very strongly that this was a story that needed to be told in different fashions. And then, of course, obviously, something that is, that is my career and that is close to my heart is the media, and how Coughlin tells the story about the evolution or the devolution of the media landscape, how politicians and activists discovered just how influential the media could be on our political landscape. Father Coughlin is often referred to as the father of hate radio, or the progenitor of kind of the right-wing talk radio that you think of from the 80s and 90s. Another kind of parallel is to a figure like Alex Jones, who is like Coughlin, sort of a fully independent, person who has cultivated a cult of personality, and who relies on listener donations to keep himself afloat. Coughlin wasn't just a pioneer in extremist media, though, because FDR, who was the president for much of the time that Coughlin was active, at first Coughlin supports FDR, and then later he rejects his support. Well, one of the factors to consider about FDR is that he was the very first president to address the American public directly using mass media rather than going through some other kind of medium. He had his fireside chats, right? Weekly radio addresses. Where do you think he got that idea from? It's a stunningly effective way to communicate with people, and analogous to something today like, say, the president tweeting, right? Bypassing whatever you think of as traditional media gatekeepers and getting your message directly to the public. These were all things that Father Coughlin pioneered before anyone even had a term to describe what he was doing. And then you have hate extremism and anti-Semitism. As I mentioned, it fits in nicely into the Exploring Hate initiative, but it also fits in really nicely into, I don't know if nicely is the right word, but sort of the national mood of the last few years. A lot of Americans were suddenly talking about hate and anti-Semitism, especially following the Charlottesville March in 2017 and the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in 2018. Obviously, the summer of 2020 really awakened a lot of conversations around systemic racism in the United States. All of these things are sort of at play here, and this is another area where you can point to a story like Father Coughlin and say these problems are not new, right? These things were being debated even back then. A lot of the correspondences with Father Coughlin and Jewish groups of the time revolve around them accusing him of saying something anti-Semitic, and him saying, "I didn't say anything anti-Semitic. I love Jews," and this sort of thing went back and forth for a long time back then. But all of this stuff is super old. You may or may not be familiar with this document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a very famous forged anti-Semitic pamphlet that purports to tell the secret plot of Jewish world domination. It was something that Henry Ford printed in his own newspaper pre-Coughlin, and then Coughlin then printed it in his newspaper. And the origins of it go back much further, and you still see it being circulated today. So again, old problems, new iterations of them. It helps, I think, to see the cyclical nature of these kinds of things in our society. Why does Father Coughlin work so well when he is a minor historical figure? I think, for one, his sort of lack of notoriety works on the audience, because you can listen to the radio show or the podcast and really not know what comes next. There's an element of suspense there, as you would find in some of the best dramas, or Netflix docuseries about scammers, things like that. There's a lot of the feedback I've gotten, when we were releasing the episodes week to week, we were hearing a lot of people say, "I can't wait to hear what happens next," and that actually, it made me really happy to hear. And then you also have, as I've sort of covered, the wide variety of topics that Father Coughlin was preaching about. How he started off doing one thing and then became really extreme and did another thing, and the way that that his story plays out over those 16 years when he was in the public spotlight. You touch on a lot of different things, a lot of different opportunities for teaching. And then I think, the core of it for me, and the reason why I kept thinking about his story for years and years, is that it sort of upends whatever you might think of as the conventional wisdom about American society. Were we always on the right side of history? Absolutely not. And this is one example of that. There's also the question of the medium itself that I think works in its favor. Podcasts, different, they're new, they're sort of hip. A lot of people find them more accessible than books. I really strongly felt from the beginning that I wanted this to be a podcast, even though when I started this project 4 years ago, I basically didn't know anything about how to make a podcast, so that was a fun experience of learning that from the ground up. But the reason I felt so strongly that this had to be an audio medium was for what you've heard, which was the archival clips of Father Coughlin's radio show. As soon as I discovered that a pretty sizable collection of them had been preserved into the digital age, I knew that this was the angle of his story that would most resonate with people, that would most give it that sort of modern feel, because you can hear him the way that his listeners would have heard him 90 years ago, and you can hear what they would have heard in his voice. He's not always ranting and raving, I should say. The early years of his show, this is reflected if you go and listen to the podcast, but he was very, he was paternal. He acted like you might expect a priest to act. He was like much more sort of educational in his tone, and he was, deeply religious and referenced the Bible and referenced Shakespeare, and was sort of bringing the audience along on this journey kind of solely through the power of his voice. And so if you're just sort of reading on paper that here was a guy who said some crazy stuff, you don't get that in as intimate of a setting as you do when you listen to it. So that's, I think, one reason why it's sticking with people more. And then, of course, everything we're able to do in the podcast medium now, which is such an exciting medium to play in. And I would again shout out the wonderful producers at Tablet Studios, because we were really able to make this sound, almost cinematic, and layers of sonic effects and all kinds of things, different elements. Obviously interviews with modern day historians and clips from radio ads of the time, and everything we could do to sort of bridge that gap between past and present in a pretty compact manner. All of that stuff was just such an exciting thing to really dig into, and so I was committed to making sure that this was produced as a podcast, because that was the form that I really wanted people to listen to it in. It helps as well that as I've sort of been saying, fascism is kind of a hot topic right now, and there are these parallel projects that I'd really recommend people check out. The middle one I want to quickly shout out. This is a new history book, Nazis of Copley Square, by the historian Charles Gallagher, that we found out was being published kind of simultaneously as the podcast, and I very quickly reached out to him and incorporated a lot of his wonderful research into my podcast, because it is so perfect. I mean, he really goes deep on the Christian front in particular, and really shows you how we shouldn't be writing these people off as a triviality. They had serious weaponry. They were military trained. This was a group that really wanted to do serious harm to America, and they were sort of written off in the press at the time as a bunch of jokers. But this is would-be insurrectionists, and again, it's been done before, right? So those historical echoes, I think, are really important for people to understand. Also, I would say this fall, you'll be hearing a lot about this topic as well. Ken Burns is planning on releasing a new PBS documentary about the U.S. and the Holocaust, which will include a fair segment on American fascist and Nazi sympathizers. So I expect Coughlin to play a role in that, as well as Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh in the America First Committee. So it's in the air. People are talking about it. There will hopefully be other opportunities to sort of rope Radioactive in the podcast back into the fray. Every time I see someone on social media mentioning Father Coughlin, I get really excited because I know that it's working. But what else is sort of happening today in this history education space? This is something that will not be news to many of you, but it's one of the things that we cover at JTA. The battle to legislate history education, right, which often goes under the framework of critical race theory. We have around 35 states that have at least debated some version of a law that restricts how history is taught in the classroom. 16 states have signed bills like this into law. And I'd be really interested during like the Q&A or during the panel to hear about how this has impacted a lot of your work as educators. I can only talk about it from my perspective as a journalist, and this has really touched on what we cover at JTA, because it's a lot of these debates have revolved around Holocaust education, or they seem to eventually come around to Holocaust education, which is where we get involved. How it typically works is the legislator will introduce a bill that is intended to restrict the teaching of critical race theory, and someone will ask, well, what about how do we teach the Holocaust? How do we teach the Holocaust from a neutral vantage point? How do we teach it without making students uncomfortable? And sometimes you get responses like this. You get a Texas school administrator who instructs his teachers to teach opposing views on the Holocaust, because that's what the state law calls for. You get an Indiana lawmaker arguing in the state house that teachers should be impartial, his actual words, on issues of Nazis and fascists. And then you have just recently the Ohio lawmaker who introduced this parallel bill in the Ohio State House, who thought that teachers should teach the Holocaust from the perspective of a German soldier, which of course means from the perspective of a Nazi. And then you probably heard about this as well. This was a really big story. Earlier this year, a local Tennessee school board voted to remove Art Spiegelman's Holocaust graphic memoir, Maus, from its middle school curriculum. This attracted so much attention that people were sending free copies of Maus to this Tennessee school district from like all over the country, and so every kid there, I'm sure, has like 2 or 3 copies by now. So you might think mission accomplished, but this sort of thing is happening more and more as we talk more about like there are a lot of school boards and parental challenges to books that are being made available to students, and we are increasingly seeing books with Jewish themes kind of get caught up in that. And so it has just become a part of this larger story. And the complication here is that Tennessee, along with many other states, and a growing number of states, have a mandate on the books to teach the Holocaust to their students. This is, there are a lot of Holocaust education groups that have pushed for statewide mandates of this sort to make sure that students are getting some kind of education about what happened, and its modern day applications. And so you have a Holocaust education mandate, and then you also have guidance or laws that say you can't use certain materials to teach about it, and so it's creating. From my perspective, it seems to be creating a lot of confusion among educators. Again, I'm really hoping we can talk about this later. All this leads to a question I never ever thought I would ask: how can Father Coughlin help? He doesn't usually do a lot of helping, right? He does a lot of tearing down and dividing people. But something that we've seen from the reaction to Radioactive is that if you present this material in an engaging and thoughtful way, it will attract an audience, and people from all ends of the political spectrum have told me what a wonderful job they think I've done with the podcast, which is again very heartening to hear, and I hope it's reaching people. But I think students and educators understand that these histories are echoing, and that this is the number one way to make sure that people are engaging with the material is to kind of think about how it's applying to their lives, and to look for those moments that remind them of things that they're experiencing themselves. And this is why I'm really sort of excited about where these conversations go. There was a video that the U.S. War Department made in 1943 that was called "Don't Be a Sucker," that was intended really to be a direct response to Father Coughlin, who by that point had been completely pushed off the national stage. which we can talk about more later if you want. But the U.S. government recognized in that moment that demagoguery is bad, and it's really dangerous to have these ideas floating around the public space. And we're obviously not, we can't legislate people's speech necessarily, but maybe we can convince people not to follow these kinds of charismatic figures who are trying to divide us. So here we go. We're going to play a little bit of this so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. There we go.
I want to give you the truth, folks. The truth about America. I know you've got a lot of questions. You want to know why you're not getting the breaks you deserve. Now, friends, I'm just an average American. But I'm an American. And some of the things I see in this country of ours make my blood boil. I see people with foreign accents making all the money. I see Negroes holding jobs that belong to me and you. Now I ask you, if we allow this thing to go on, what's going to become of us real Americans?
In 1943, the U.S. War Department produced a short film called Don't Be a Sucker, designed to be shown to Americans everywhere.
Excuse me, young man, but are you actually going to read that stuff? Sure, why not? You heard what he said. Yes, I heard. Do you believe in that kind of talk?
No,
Makes pretty good sense to me. I was born in Hungary, but now I am an American citizen. And I have seen what this kind of talk can do. I saw it in Berlin.
I have seen what this kind of talk can do. I saw it in Berlin, right? So by 1943, the U.S. is banking on everyone sort of understanding that the Nazis are the bad guys, and that it wouldn't be so good to follow this ideology to its logical conclusion. This was an anti-fascist propaganda movie made by the U.S. government, and it was very popular not only at the time, but it went viral just a couple years ago in 2017. Somebody dug it up and put it online, and everyone started watching it again, which is to say that history is going viral, right? And that's why these kinds of things these kinds of projects are so important. These projects, podcasts or documentaries or what have you, not only do we draw on pre-existing archives to create this narrative, but then the item itself, the show itself, actually stands as an archive. In the case of Father Coughlin, the most recent biographies about him, print biographies, are all out of print, right? This is Radioactive is going to be the most accessible way people will have to learn about him, and nobody is going there because they know who Father Coughlin is, right? They're going there for the story, and they might have some idea of it, but I'm really trying to introduce them to an entirely new world, and that's hopefully, I guess at the core of it, an educational value, even though I had not intended it to be so. But this is really, I think, an exciting moment to have these kinds of conversations, presuming that we can navigate them safely. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm excited to talk more about this. You want this off the screen, right? Okay.
Well, now for my next trick, I'm going to use the handheld microphone here, which seems to be working. And I want to say a very special thank you and compliments to Andrew for quite a fascinating presentation. I hope that you have gotten enough of the gist of this to actually tune in to the podcast. And it's worth every episode, I think, to listen and learn. So, Andrew, have a seat over here, and I'm going to invite my colleagues, my friends, wherever you're comfortable, grab a microphone. I'm going to sit here at the end. I'm very happy to introduce Rabbi Dan Zemmel, a dear friend, an educator, my rabbi, Danny Zemmel, and my dear colleague, Professor Lionel Howard, who is a member of the faculty in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, a psychologist by training, a methodologist by passion, and a wonderful teacher and educator. And so let me, first of all, I'm going to sit and start this off with a question to you, Andrew, and then I'm going to ask Lionel and Danny to start the conversation as you would like. Would you say a little bit more about Father Coughlin's own upbringing and the experiences that you think might have shaped what he became as an adult preacher and radio priest and demagogue?
Yes. Hello. All right. Great. Yes, absolutely. So Father Coughlin was an immigrant. He was Canadian and grew up kind of always in the shadow of the church. Right, his parents pushed him from a young age to enter the priesthood, and his real gift, though, when he was in school, was for oratory and theater and performance. And these were the qualities of his that the people who knew him back then really latched onto and said that's what defined Father Coughlin. So he loved Shakespeare, he loved putting on plays at the seminary, and he really thrived when he had to present an oral exam, right? And he would often just kind of go off and fabricate something and talk for like an hour, and maybe 10% of what you heard was true, but his audience was so wowed by it that they applauded him anyway, which I think is a good, succinct, forebear of kind of what was to come for Father Coughlin. And so when his gift for oratory is what gets him noticed by the bishop of the Detroit diocese at the time, and actually brings him to start this new parish in Royal Oak. And then it's again his gift for oratory that leads him to come up with the idea to have his sermons over the radio as a fundraising technique, so that he could build the church the size that he thought it should be, right, to really fill his ego. So he came at this, and I'm not saying, I mean, I think his belief in the church was for all we know was there, but it was really much more his ego, his love of performance that crafted what he would become. I've also heard some folks historians who are smarter than me kind of speculate that because he grew up in the Irish Catholic tradition, there was probably a certain amount of anti-British sentiment to his upbringing, and that could have led to a refusal to kind of support Allied forces in the war. And from there you sort of find other examples of Catholic sponsored anti-Semitism and sort of things like that he might have been exposed to.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I think that helps me at least get a little bit of I don't know what to call it, a longitudinal sense of where he was and what he became. Let me now turn to our guests. What I think might be useful here is if each of you were to take a few minutes and offer maybe the 2 or 3 most compelling lessons that you draw from the presentation and from this history with respect to your lives as educators, fundamentally. So I'll start with our external guest, if that's all right, Rabbi Zemmel.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Andrew. Your presentation was terrific just now, and I listened to the podcast several months ago, and it was great. One takeaway that I have that I thought about as I listened to the podcast, and comes up for me now as I'm thinking about this, is the seduction of lies. And I find 2 parallels in Father Coughlin's lies that make the lies so seductive, and that's their packaging. In the podcast, I believe you point out, and my memory can be faulty, but you comment how as a student in seminary, when he's maybe in a sermon class or something, or you say he has a talent and an aptitude for oral presentation and maybe oral exams, he is quoting a part of the Bible, which is the Apocrypha, a less well-known part of the Bible, which is actually biblical text only for Catholics, but not for Protestants or Jews, Okay, the Apocrypha texts are non-canonical ancient texts, but they are canonical for Catholics. So he's quoting in these classes a part of the Bible which is less known, but he's also making it up. He's fabricating. This is actually not part of the Apocrypha. So he's packaging lies in an authoritative source. It's a less well-known part of the authoritative source, but he's putting it out there, making it difficult to rebut. That's one. And then, in some ways, he comes back to that on the radio, that technique, by quoting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a forgery, as if it's written by a cabal of Jewish leaders. It's not written by a cabal of Jewish leaders. It's actually a foreign import. It's created by the perpetrators of the Kishinev massacre in 1903. So it's a Russian text, a Ukrainian text, in a sense, which has all kinds of other overtones. So he's quoting it in Detroit to a national broadcast, but these lies then take on an authoritative, again, and I'm thinking to myself, how do you combat that? How it makes it so much more difficult to respond to, because there are so many obstacles for the person who's the educated truth teller to respond. There are a number of roadblocks in simply bringing the truth to the fore, because the lies have been so well and so seductively packaged. That's one thing I'm thinking about at the moment. I'll pause now.
Okay, that's good. Andrew, jot down in your mental space here, packaging, because we're going to get back to this. I'd like to hear what Lionel might have as early reactions to this.
Right. First of all, thank you, Andrew, for that presentation. I've learned just quite a bit just listening today, but also having a chance to look at some parts of the transcript from the podcast. So I have a couple of thoughts that I'll share initially. So last night, we actually had a presentation as a part of our research colloquium for the Education and Inequalities PhD program in education. And we invited a historian from Bakersfield College in California, San Joaquin Valley, and his colleague at Cal State Bakersfield. And they recently received a National Endowment of the Humanities grant to do what you could call critical place-based pedagogy, and looking at sort of the landmarks and how we can use landmarks in history within the context of education. And so they're proposing a workshop where they would bring teachers to participate in this, I guess you would call it like a training or development opportunity about how to sort of talk about and use local histories and plays as a curriculum. And part of their curriculum talks about, for example, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huertas and the labor movement, and sort of the ways in which the Hispanic community and the Filipino community contributed to what was happening in America's breadbasket. But they also bring in the African American perspective as well in that same region. And so I see your work as another way in which we can sort of think about quote unquote US history and the different narratives that are presented, and also the ways in which certain narratives just don't get the attention that they deserve, but are instrumental to how we are as a society today. And so I see your work being a part of a larger set of tools that we could use within the context of our K-12 and even higher education. So I think that's something that we could sort of talk more about. Also, I was thinking about the sort of use of technologies. And so this was a radio broadcast, and then you talked about in the end of your presentation the use of social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and the ways in which some of these tactics are sort of reifying and the more contemporary technologies. And even with the current potential, I think it's a done deal, the takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk, and this idea of making it sort of an open space for different dialogues evokes a lot of concern for people, for things very much like what we see in Father Coughlin. And so I think that you're in the front of a conversation that's happening in real time here in this project. But it also makes me wonder, too, the ways in which history can be instructive, but also can give, sort of repeats itself and can sort of present in ways that we don't want it to, right? We want to sort of learn from it, but not for people to sort of replicate that to continue to subjugate and contribute to discrimination in all of its forms. So you've given us a lot, given me a lot to sort of think about across different sort of levels of the conversation.
Take it away.
Thank you. I definitely recommend that everyone at some point sit on a panel where people tell you how great you are. It's good for the ego. No, I really appreciate those insights, because that was all stuff that I was playing with in the making of the podcast, and have continued to think about for years after. The lies with the lies packaged with authority, right? That's definitely a volatile way to spread lies, and we saw that many times in Coughlin's career, where he uses his priest's collar as a sort of defensive shield, because you're not gonna contradict a priest, but it also sort of gave him authority even with people who were not Catholic. Right, because his audience was much broader than that. It was the authority in his voice. It was the charisma that he brought to his work. You frequently hear people like fans of his who would talk to the news media during that time would say, he speaks the truth. That's why we listen to him. And did they mean the literal truth, or did they mean he just says things the way that we see the world, and so we perceive that as true? I think that's a lot of the debate we're having right now around truth and what does it mean, and trust in the media is at an all-time low, and people have to trust something, right? And so what are they trusting? I think then you sort of get into that question. And then absolutely the sort of bring out the lesser known parts of American history, right? Make sure all those stories get told. I think that was definitely a motivator for me, and I don't remember so many people being so engaged in American history questions when I was in high school, the way that things seem to be playing out online today. And I don't know if that's a factor of social media. I suspect that's probably a big part of it, but I think it's also just there are a lot of people now who just want to understand kind of where we came from, and the sense that I mean it's impossible to get the full story of history in class, but then what are you choosing to present to people? That's a big part of it. Henry Ford, we actually did learn about Henry Ford in school. We learned about him as an industry mogul and as an entrepreneur and a pioneer, and introduced the $5 workday, and he brought all of this great economic opportunity to Detroit. We did not hear about his love of Nazism. That was something I had to learn about on my own. So it's definitely telling the full story is challenging, but also necessary.
Please, Lionel, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, you see that challenge in the 1619 Project, right? And the ways in which Nicole Hannah-Jones' work has been sort of placed under a microscope, right? And challenged in so many ways. And even in the reissuing of the book, she talks about sort of taking on that critique and doing additional research, but just the ways in which it was received and how it's been, in my eyes, vilified as text, right? Because it's a narrative that we don't want to talk about, right? Because it makes us look at ourselves in ways that just aren't so good. And so I sort of wonder, will that critique happen in this podcast too, right? Or maybe you're already sort of seeing it happening.
I've been I feel like kind of fortunate because I haven't had quite as many negative reactions to the podcast. I didn't get into this in the presentation, but the previous Monsignor at Shrine, so the guy who was basically the head pastor there until recently, he was appointed to another diocese. He actually sat down with me and had a conversation about Father Coughlin, and we had several different conversations over the course of a couple of years. And the first time we talked was in, I think, the spring of 2018, and he said, I don't think about Father Coughlin all that much. We think about him in the context of the church and all that stuff, but he did apologize. He was like, I'm sorry if his words have been hurtful. Cut to following the Tree of Life shooting, and now he has actually made several public statements and gone on the radio to have conversations about Father Coughlin and about the historical role that he played in spreading hate and anti-Semitism, and pledging to do better as the institution of Shrine of the Little Flower in combating anti-Semitism. And his very last speech, sermon to his congregation was about Father Coughlin's anti-Semitism. And so we see that I think, yeah, current events prompted him and prompted that institution to re-examine its own history, something that had happened 80, 90 years ago. They felt that was important in that moment, which I think that's the kind of reaction that history educators are sort of always hoping for and maybe rarely see. But yeah, I have found the really intense reaction to the 1619 project to be indicative of something, some willingness or unwillingness to talk honestly about history. But then, of course, the attention being paid to it anyway means that there is some kind of conversation happening, and that has continued to be so.
I want to try to pick up on both of your questions and Andrew's answer here in the following way. I think you pointed out in the presentation, and it comes across in the podcast, that radio in the 1920s and 30s was a new thing. And for me, that is a reminder that every technology comes with its downside risks. And there you had radio, which was clearly a fabulous invention, with the possibility of being exploited and for bad goals, for bad purposes, by a guy like Coughlin. Fast forward, you have the internet and you have social media, which are viewed by some people as the great democratization of information, which people essentially associate with the lack of any kind of curatorial authority, and everybody gets a chance to mouth off. And again, the internet, I think, is an amazing technology. I mean, that's sort of the most banal thing you've probably heard all week. But the downside risk of that is the diffusion of packaged lies. So I want to get back to that. And then I want to ask whether, and in particular, maybe Lionel, you'll take this one, is there a way to introduce into our teaching, whether at the high school or college level, enough about these tensions between the benefits and risks of technology so that at least people can face that with a little bit more awareness? You see what I'm getting at? So let me go back then to Danny. If you want to think about these packaged lies in the context of one of the great things about American history and American society is our putative freedom of speech that comes with these kinds of risks.
As I think about the packaging of the lies and what the lies are purporting to represent, I thinking about how to respond to them. And my next thought then goes to how lies can become symbols. So you're talking about banning books. There's the next thing in the paper is the burning of books, which somebody proposed today. I think a state legislator, I believe in Ohio, was asked, once these books were taken out of the curriculum, what would you like to do with them? He said, I'd like to burn them. And now you can go to Berlin, and there's a memorial to where books were really burned. And the symbolism of that. So it seems to me that one way to respond to lies or to these kinds of things is to try and create symbols out of them and use the symbol to be something to teach from. And that has me then thinking about this huge iconic symbol in front of the church. And listening to your podcast, I'm listening to something, the photo is breathtaking. this then got me thinking about the debate we're having in this country over symbols. That is, every single statue of anybody is now a subject of debate. And I'm totally sympathetic with taking down the statues of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, all of this. But I also think there's an opportunity here to leave the statue up and turn it itself into an education forum about why this was put there. And I wonder if there's a way to leverage the Father Coughlin broadcast to go back to the people at the church and say, you have an opportunity to model for the country of turning this iconic thing into a teaching technique for how hate can become manifested in so many ways, and they could create kind of an educational center within the church, using their own front door as a symbol.
Lionel, I think and then we're going to see if there are some comments that might have come in from our listeners and viewers out there. In our teaching, we encounter this predicament. Does one present imagery that symbolically and factually represents something that is that is shocking, that can be painful, and that is a reminder of very difficult history? What do we do?
So that's an impossible question to answer, right? And I think when we're seeing lots of conversations and discussions and debates about that very issue. So I do have a couple of thoughts. One, I do think that we need to have those representations as a part of the curriculum. I think where we have to increase our capacity is how do we help teachers lead those conversations, engage in that curriculum exchange, right? And I'm not sure that we've figured out how to do that yet in our teacher education programs. Some are doing better than others, right? But I think we have to equip people to have those conversations and to take up those artifacts or those symbols, those narratives, in ways that invites sort of a critical consideration of them, right? So part of what we talk about often is teaching young people to be critical thinkers, right? I'm of the mindset that we have to help them be critical consumers of knowledge, right? So how do they ask questions of what's being offered to them as knowledge, as legitimate forms of knowledge, right? And so that might help us move a little bit forward. Not sure how much, but it'll help us move forward. My sense is that many people are very sort of uncertain about those conversations and how to have them. And if you don't have opportunity to practice and build capacity to have them, you don't ever get there. Of course, as a developmental psychologist, I think about what's age appropriate, right? And sort of what children at different levels of development should be exposed to, what their cognitive capacities can sort of handle in those conversations, but also the emotional, psychological implications of those conversations, right? So we have to think about the whole person and how they are affected by the curriculum. So we can't just throw it in, have the conversation, and not think about what's the reverb from those conversations. So it's a really a larger system, to me, responsibility in how we sort of do this work. And I think, too, your earlier question about technology, it wouldn't hurt us, and maybe this already exists, that there are courses or lessons that talk about sort of the ethics of technology, right? And sort of how we engage with technology and how it can be used in all kinds of ways, and what's our responsibility as consumers and producers of these tools that could be a part of a larger set of curriculum that we could offer students at different levels. I'm thinking back to when I first started college, and I'm dating myself here. I think I look young, but I'm quite further along. Many students didn't have personal computers, right? We still had the computer lab where you would go and write your papers on the 5.25-inch floppy disk, right? And one of the major concerns was that if we moved towards personal computers, students wouldn't leave their dorm rooms, residence halls. they wouldn't develop their social capacities, right? And we did a lot of sort of effort to bring people out of their rooms to engage in sort of a social opportunity. And so the same ways that we're thinking about that issue, we could think about other technologies too. How do we sort of help people navigate the terrain around these innovations? So that's just some initial thoughts that I do have.
While I'm waiting to see whether we have some questions or comments from outside the room, is there anybody inside the room who would like to ask a question or get into this conversation? Professor Dwayne Wright. I identified you. I hope that's okay. Does he need a mic or?
So I'm going to give the mic back because I do want to hear what the rabbi has to say about this question. First and foremost, thank you for the presentation. I find it fascinating because I'm a nerd like that. But I do think that the knowledge that has been expressed is deep, and we need to kind of unpack a lot of it. I want to kind of move away from the core of the conversation to another issue, and I'll take advantage of the fact that we have a rabbi, a reporter, and a psychologist, and an economist all on the same panel, right? So here's my question. I think often, and I've been thinking often, of the use and misuse of Martin Luther King and his quotes. And, you know, certain selective quotes that have been used by others to paint him in a light that, quite frankly, no one in America that lived through that era would remember. One of those quotes that people don't talk about is the riot is the language of the unheard, of the oppressed, of those that have been ignored too long ago. And what I found from the presentation that was interesting, and particularly my own current history, is that it seems that as economic strife goes up, our appreciation for the truth goes down. It almost seems to be an inverse relationship. So here's my question. What responsibility do we, as those that have a little bit more than those that do not have, to prevent the intellectual riot? Because I think people following people like Father Coughlin, following people like the 45th President of the United States, is its own intellectual riot. You know, there's own people not necessarily taking the facts because, you know, it's hard to worry about facts when you and your baby are starving, right? And we don't really talk about that much. You know, these demagogues come and they go, but the situations that create the epic unfair economic inequality that forces populism and popular people to follow these demagogues never get discussed. So since we're here to talk about that, I just want to throw that, and if anyone has any thoughts about that, what responsibility do we have to sort of eliminate and reduce the intellectual riot that allows people to follow someone like a Father Coughlin?
I'd be glad to give my microphone to anyone here to take on that question.
I'm just thinking about that because that was so well put, and there's been so much really insightful statements made here that I'm wrestling with, and I feel like it's almost my duty as a journalist to keep thinking about those questions as I go, right? Because in my industry, we like to think that we will tell people the truth and we will properly vet it and we will try to call out other people when they lie, and that is us doing our jobs, and so that's our contribution to society. But of course, that doesn't work when people don't want to listen to what you're saying in the first place. When there is that, like, that's a great phrase, intellectual riot, right? Because that's how that is really what's happening. It's like it's sort of this active choice to believe in what you want to believe, and you know, I think to go back to something Lionel said earlier, like we don't really have a way to teach media literacy to students, but it seems increasingly clear that this is one area that we really need to have a curriculum for. Everyone's living their entire lives on social media now, being bombarded constantly with information, and it is becoming increasingly hard to separate truth from fiction. And sometimes it's designed that way, and sometimes it's something that you're opting into. But either way, it's sort of a willingness to just jump down rabbit holes, and it's almost like you're not understanding really what you're dealing with. So I do think finding some way to teach media literacy in schools would be certainly one step, and I think for us in journalism, it's going to be a more complicated answer to that question. JTA reaches Jews across the political spectrum, and we sort of like to think of ourselves as operating under the pretense that we have common areas of interest, and there are we can sort of talk to multiple audiences at once, and that puts us in maybe a more favorable vantage point than a place like, say, the New York Times, where a lot of people have very sort of preconceived notions about what they're writing about. So that's what we always strive to do. Is there's these conversations are becoming increasingly tricky to navigate in a way where we can speak to people who hold a wide variety of beliefs without making anyone feel like we're holding the truth from them and they need to turn away from us and go somewhere else. It's a real ongoing conversation. I thank you for that. I'll let others talk.
That's a great question, right? And I'm not sure that there is a singular way to diminish the riot, right? I guess in my mind, and maybe I'm a pessimist, right? And maybe I'm jaded at this point in my life and career, but I don't know that the conversation can stop, so to speak, right? So as a professor, I think about what I can do in my courses, in my own scholarship, right? And then what happens with that scholarship when it moves into the public sphere, right? And how it gets consumed. And so really thinking about how I represent the narratives of the communities that I'm in service of. So when I'm writing about the development of Black boys and Black children, thinking about how that work gets used in different spaces, right? So policymakers or other people who are funding programs that's supposed to, quote unquote, support the development of all children, right? How that gets consumed. So I talk a lot about representation and what's our responsibility and thinking about what that looks like and who gets positioned as vulnerable through that representation. And there's only so much we can control. Obviously, people can take our scholarship, our research, and use it in ways that it wasn't intended, take it out of context. If you sort of think about a just larger discourse analysis and the ways that discourses function to create identity, particular ways that it situates people in relationship to each other, right? I think there's a lot of things that happen. So from my place of perspective, I think about it and how I'm training researchers and practitioners, but also thinking about my own practice, right? And the ways I show up in the classroom and position my own standpoints, right? And so I often tell students, this is my standpoint. I'm trained in a particular way, right? And if we are honest, we know that all institutions of higher education have standpoints, whether explicitly named or not, right? And so you learn under your advisors, and they've learned under particular advisors. And so you have these quote unquote families of thought that persist, right? And so I try to name that explicitly for students, but then also let them know that there are other perspectives too that help us think about children's development or methodologies that might offer additional perspective and insight that we should also consider. And so that's one way I think we can try to begin to manage that, but that's also talking to a particular audience, right? I think your question also speaks to the folks who may not have access to these spaces of higher education or what have you, right? How do we sort of engage those spaces? And I can think about people who are doing participatory research or working at community-based research where they're really sort of trying to work in the community as a part of the community to sort of have these conversations, share information, give the tools to be critical consumers of these ideas. So I think that can also help along the way. So that's how I sort of think about your question.
So we've got the journalist's answer, the educator's answer, and now the, shall we say, organized religious community is going to weigh in on this.
I find your question very complicated and piercing and painful, quite actually. I do not know how to make everybody feel like they're part of a larger whole. I mean, I think the intellectual riot, if I understand the term that we're experiencing in this country, I think has parallels to the intellectual riot of Nazi Germany, where Hitler made a particular class feel like the most beleaguered class in the country, your population group, and we see the same phenomena going on here. The group that does not seem to be suffering is being made to feel like the most group that everybody is trying to pile on. It reminds me of a conversation I had with a dear friend who is now retired but was a career lawyer in the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And this lawyer was asked sometime in the 1980s in the Ed Meese Justice Department, Attorney General at the time, to compile a report on all of the appellate cases that had taken that they decided to take on appeal in terms of civil rights appeal cases the Justice Department did over a 2-year period. And the person said to me the following. He said that it was a fascinating project. They worked on it for 3 months, and they said, on a microscopic level, every individual case that was brought on appeal by the Justice Department had merits. On an individual basis, every single case had merits. When this person weighed the entire picture on the macroscopic level, the entire thing, the only conclusion that could be drawn that over this 2-year period, the most discriminated against group in America were white males. So each individual case, this case makes sense, but when you look at the macro picture, well, the macro picture is ridiculous. And so I think it takes smart educators like you. I'm just a rabbi dealing with a group of, but I think to try and figure out a way to make a common sense analysis of going from the micro to the macro. I don't know how to do that. There's clearly, in Ed Meese Justice Department, there's clearly a certain ideology that's driving it, but also there has to be a way to tear away the curtain, to show that the emperor has no clothes, so to speak. I don't know how to do that.
We have, were you raising your hand? I was, yes. Great. Let me get you a microphone and then.
Thank you. So I'm a friend of Andrew's, but I'm fortunate that I attend a public school where we learned that Henry Ford was not a good dude. But my question is about Holocaust and World War II education. I'm a product of the Maryland public school system, and I believe our mandate was 1/4 had to be spent on World War II. So you're a history teacher, and you're trying to teach all of American history, but 1/4 has to be devoted to 10 years. And I think the way the math works out, we spent, for example, a lot less time on slavery and the slave trade. So my question is, in blue states, where there is a look now to try how do we make our teaching of American history more equitable. Should there be a reduction in time spent on World War II and, quote, Holocaust education? And perhaps maybe, I don't know if Lionel knows, is that actually happening? Is that debate happening in blue states right now, at least? Do we need to reduce the time we spend on the Holocaust? And then what would be you all's advice to educators who are needing to make those changes?
Oh yeah. Well, sure. I'm not one to say what there should or should not be, but in my reporting that I've done about Holocaust education, I've actually heard from a lot of people who work in the field of Holocaust education who are really against these ideas of statewide mandates that are sort of dictating the length or even the requirement that certain periods of history be taught, because there's no guarantee of quality when you're like just because you're having a quarter of the year devoted to one subject doesn't mean it's going to be taught well, especially if the teacher doesn't have a lot of familiarity with that. And then, as you said, that also has the effect of reducing the amount of time you can spend talking about other things. It seems to me that teaching American history is almost a fool's game from the beginning, because it just keeps going. Like there's always a larger curriculum to talk about, and only the same finite amount of space. I mean, we barely talked about the the Vietnam War in my high school, because by the time we got there, it was yeah. Which you do in Michigan. There's tend to be a lot of snow days, but that is to say that even there's a lot of division even within the space of proponents of Holocaust education, of how much and to what degree and how you teach it and at what age do you teach it, and that question of time management does come up over and over. So as these things are being debated, I think we'll be seeing a lot more of that discussion play out.
I'll just say one thing on this. I went to college a long time ago. In my undergraduate education, when I did take a semester-long course on the Holocaust, there were two prerequisite courses you had to take. You had to take a full semester course in European history, and you can't learn all of European history in one semester, but you had to take a semester course in European history. It didn't matter which one you had to take a semester, and you had to take a one semester course in Jewish history. I don't know how the Holocaust could be 4 years of somebody's full-time education and more. Again, let's limit the questions to simple questions. I mean, I don't know how you can teach the Holocaust without giving a very, very, very thick context for what it was. And for me, it should be taught in a European history kind of context and not an American history context.
I'm not familiar with the distribution of curriculum within the state. It's not my expertise, but your question made me think about one of our doctoral graduates, Dr. Joanne Katz, who her dissertation looked at the teaching of the Holocaust in a predominantly African-American school. And so there was this interesting combination of teaching about enslaved Africans and the Holocaust. And so might be a great resource for us to think about how to teach multiple histories when we're challenged by the state mandates for curriculum coverage. That might be useful. So I'll offer that. And I believe she was teaching perhaps in some ways for Brandeis. So her scholarship, her work might be of interest, might be a resource for teachers. And she was a part of our curriculum pedagogy program, teacher education.
We're almost at time, and I want to be respectful of that. But I do want to ask each of you to just sort of, look, I'm the dean of an ed school. I'm looking for some practical guidance on how to not solve this problem. I don't really think these problems have quote unquote solutions. I would like some guidance about what can we be doing that can at least do a better job of informing, of preparing our students, ourselves, and coping with this. Again, if we think about the radioactive, coping with a period in our own lives when we are overwhelmed with, through social media, whether he's aware of it or not, he is exposing us and informing us. So you can take off on that one. Then I'm going to ask Lionel, because I know you think about this a lot from the standpoint of what we're trying to accomplish in an education school that cares deeply about these kinds of issues. And then you get the last word because you had the first word.
Seems fair. I have two partial thoughts for that. I think it's I think it's important to teach all kinds of stories and all kinds of narratives, but not falsehoods, and help people draw their own conclusions. Jewish, the rabbinic tradition, and I'll just Ma'aseh shehaya, ma'aseh shehaya, ma'aseh shehaya. It's example, 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 and the student, the reader, is drawing the conclusion of what the principle, of what the example is, and I think that by itself, I think, is a way to make, by itself is a way to make the reader, the student, an active learner, because it's on them to draw the principle. So it's kind of to somehow in the curriculum of our schools, and then in terms of teacher training, how to teach this, to teach the freedoms that we have in this country, which seems so under threat, and the notion that next to the word freedom, in parentheses all the time, there's an understanding of responsibility, because I think the country.
So, Dr. Wright's question is still resonating in my head, and my thought is that if there's a way for us to really think about how to have the conversation in other spaces, right? It's one thing to sit in the academy, to sit on G Street in this institution to have the conversation, but how do we sort of move down to a dialogue? And I'm thinking about the ways in which I imagine sort of organizing, right? And we think about sort of labor movements and other movements where there's a dialogue that happens with the populace, right, about what's happening, and providing people with an understanding of, for example, how our government works, right? Some of the things that escape people in their formal education for all sorts of create a space for that shared education, but also reminders to us of their very lived experiences, that as someone who has a set of resources, I move through this world very differently. Even as I'm still tethered to my community as a first generation college student, as a Black person, as a queer identified man, right? All these things that sort of mediate how I make sense of the world, right? So how do we create space to have those conversations? And the ed school could be a space where that happens, right? And about how we think about and frame education, quite frankly, and who is the holder of quote unquote sort of knowledge, or who can generate knowledge, right? So I think that's one way. It may be an identity shift for the school, right, for the institution, but I think that's one way to begin to perhaps address some of the intellectual rioting that happens, and to create space for new possibilities. So that's something
I think whatever form the education and the conversations wind up taking, whether it's in the academic space, or it's in K through 12, or it's in more innovative ways in the communities. Like, something I've found working on the show is that people seem to really want to respond to the commonalities, right? To the narratives, which is a lot of what I do as a journalist and a storyteller is to find those narratives, and that's how everyone sort of has those moments of obsessiveness with a certain kind of story that you can't let go of. And for me, it was just seeing all the echoes and all of the things that seemed to be happening before my eyes that related to this story, and the sense that, well, we've been through this before. Like, why don't we know that? And so that was like, it was like that quest for knowledge that sort of led me down that hole. And I think, as I said in the talk, that seems to be one thing that people were responding to. And I think the commonalities, and what is the identity of our country if you take the long view, and how much does the past inform what we're experiencing today. And these are all like super resonant questions that like everyone is dealing with in some way or another, even if we might not think that we are. And I think finding a way to give a voice and language to those questions that everyone is already wrestling with is a good avenue that I've found in my work for finding ways for people to engage with that question. And I do think media literacy is so important. So I'll just say that again. I'll stick that on the end.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm quite serious that these are actually implementable, if that's a word, notions, and the idea of using the space of an education school in a university actually as a place to engage, as a place to confront not just a difficult history, but different narratives of that history. That for me is the dream of what a well-functioning university is, such as ours. And in fact, this series, this Conversations That Matter, is very much along the lines of at least going 1 inch in the direction of creating that kind of possibility. So to end on my colleagues know I try to end these things on a somewhat more upbeat, positive note. It gives me great hope and a certain sense of optimism that we can even have work on. And I just want to thank Danny and Lionel for being part of this, and very much thank you to Andrew Lapin for the work and for the presentation today. Keep at it, and we will continue the conversation, and we hope it has mattered.